My phone lit up with his name at 4:47 in the afternoon, and I almost didn't answer. Something in my gut told me not to. But I picked it up anyway, because that's what I do. I answer, I listen, I show up. I've always been that way, ever since we were kids, and he was the golden child and I was the one scraping by, doing whatever it took to get ahead. He was calling to apologize, or so I thought. His voice was frantic, desperate, something I'd never heard from him before. His words came fast, stumbling over each other. There's been a problem, a serious problem. I need your help. My stomach dropped before he even told me what had happened. I could hear it in his voice, the panic, the desperation, the unraveling. But before we get to that phone call, before I tell you about his begging and pleading and the way he showed up at my door with tears in his eyes, you need to understand where this really started. You need to understand what led to this moment. The rejection, the ridicule, the way he looked at me when he said those words, "You're not successful enough." That's where the story truly begins. Not with the phone call, not with his desperation, but with a single moment that changed everything between us. A moment when I finally understood that no amount of loyalty, no amount of showing up, no amount of being the good brother was ever going to be enough for him. It wasn't about success. It was never about success. It was about power. It was about control. It was about him deciding whether I was worthy of inclusion or worthy of being cast aside like I'd never mattered at all. The office was the kind of place that intimidated people who weren't used to money. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, glass tables that reflected the sky, and people who all looked like they'd won something that everyone else had lost. He was standing there with two men in expensive suits, both of them laughing, both of them looking at me like I was something amusing that had wandered into their space. His office, his deal, his kingdom. I'd been waiting in the lobby for 20 minutes before he came down, and when he did, he didn't apologize for making me wait. He just smiled that smile, the one he'd perfected over the years, the one that said he was comfortable here in a way I never would be. "Come up," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. "There's people I want you to meet." I followed him to the 34th floor, and he introduced me to the two men who were his partners on the deal, a residential development project, 300 units, millions in potential profit. He'd mentioned it to me over the phone a few days earlier, dropping hints, building anticipation. I thought he wanted my advice. I thought maybe, after all these years, he finally recognized something in me worth listening to. We sat around the glass table and he pulled out renderings, architectural plans, market analyses, numbers that made my head spin. $220,000 minimum to get in on the ground floor. The investment opportunity of a lifetime, one of the partners said. The kind of thing that separates people who built wealth from people who worked jobs for the rest of their lives. I listened, I asked questions, I tried to understand the numbers, and I realized sitting there that I could do it. Not easily, not without stretching myself thin and taking significant risks, but I could find that money. I had equity in my house, I had savings, I had accounts I could access, I could liquidate some investments. For the first time in years, I thought maybe I could participate in something like this, something real, something big, something that might finally elevate me in their eyes, his eyes, my brother's eyes, something that might prove I was more than just a freelance consultant scraping by. I took a breath and said, "I'm interested. I can get the capital together. I can do this." And then they laughed. All three of them. A genuine, from-the-belly laugh like I'd just told the funniest joke they'd ever heard in their entire lives. This was years in the making, this rejection. Not the development deal specifically, but the pattern it was part of. The template that had defined our entire relationship. We grew up in the same house, same parents, same circumstances, but somehow we ended up on completely different trajectories. He was the one who'd always known what he wanted. At 15, he was talking about business school and real estate ventures. By 25, he'd already closed his first deal. I was struggling. I was trying. I was working retail jobs and service industry gigs, taking night classes, trying to figure out who I was and what I was going to do with my life. I was late to the game, but I wasn't stupid. I eventually figured it out. Started my own consulting business. Nothing flashy, nothing that would make headlines, but solid, sustainable. Honest work that paid the bills and then some. I built something. Not what he built, not on his scale, but something real, something I could be proud of. But he'd never really acknowledged it. When I told him I'd started the business, he nodded politely and then immediately pivoted to talking about his own ventures. When I had success, he had bigger success. When I grew, he grew faster. It was like being in a race where the finish line kept moving every time I got close. Our parents were still alive then, and I remember my mother saying at dinner one night, "I'm so proud of both of you," and I believed her. But I also knew that the pride she had for me and the pride she had for him were different things. Not in magnitude necessarily, but in kind. His success was expected. Mine was surprising. His was inevitable. Mine was a pleasant turn of events. After they died 5 years ago, even that pretense faded away. We saw each other maybe twice a year, holidays, the occasional family obligation. We weren't really close anymore if we ever had been. I'd made peace with that. I figured that was just how some families worked. You grew up together, then you grew apart. Natural, inevitable. Sad, maybe, but not something you could fight against forever. I had my life. He had his. We existed in separate spheres until he called me about the real estate deal. I'd been trying to reinvent myself a bit. The consulting business had been good, but I was starting to feel the limitations. Freelance work, gig-based income, no real assets building, no real wealth accumulating. I kept reading articles about people who'd made it big in real estate. Their stories were everywhere. And I kept thinking about what my brother had been saying for years, that real estate was where the real money was made. You build something once and keep making money off it. Or you flip properties and double your investment, or you partner on developments and watch your money multiply. It made sense. It was logical. It seemed like the next evolution of my success. And I wanted in. So when he called me up, I thought maybe this was his way of extending an olive branch. Maybe he'd finally decided that siblings should support each other. Maybe he'd finally recognized potential in me that he could get behind and invest in. I should have known better. I had enough years of history to know better. But hope is a dangerous thing. Hope makes you stupid. Hope makes you vulnerable. Hope makes you believe things that aren't true. He'd asked me to come down to his office on a Thursday. I'd rearranged my schedule, driven across town, sat in that lobby wearing the best suit I owned, which I suddenly realized didn't fit in with the other people sitting around me. Their shoes cost more than my suit. Their watches cost more than my car. And I was there thinking I was about to become part of their world. Thinking I was going to walk out of that building as an investor in something real, something big, something that would finally matter. Instead, I got laughed at. His laugh was the worst part. Not because it was cruel, although it was, but because it was performative. He was laughing for the benefit of his partners. He was showing them that he wasn't really connected to me, that my suggestion was absurd enough to mock, that we weren't really the same kind of people at all. One of the partners said, "Your brother seems optimistic." And my brother said, looking right at me, "You're not successful enough to be part of this real estate deal." That's what he said. He said it like it was just a fact, a simple statement of reality. Not cruel, not mean, just true. The way you might say the sky's blue or water is wet. You're not successful enough. As if success was something that could be measured with such precision, as if he and his partners had run the numbers on me and concluded I simply didn't meet the threshold. I wanted to respond. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut through his smugness and make him understand what he'd just done, but I couldn't find the words, or maybe the words didn't exist, so I just sat there and watched them laugh. That was 4 weeks ago. 4 weeks of replaying that moment over and over in my mind. 4 weeks of anger and humiliation and something harder to name. Not quite revenge, but something in that neighborhood. Something dark and sharp. Something about wanting him to feel what I felt. Something about wanting him to understand. I didn't do anything with that feeling at first. I just carried it with me like a stone in my pocket, went to work, paid my bills, lived my life. But something had shifted deep inside me. Something fundamental had broken between us. I was building something during those 4 weeks, not a business or investment, just a quiet, cold resolve. A firm decision that I was completely done trying to be part of his world, done seeking his approval, done being the brother who always showed up and always accepted being treated like I didn't measure up. I was going to move on with my life, genuinely move forward. And then he called. He called me on a Monday afternoon, a week after the meeting. His voice was strained, desperate. "I need to meet with you," he said. "There's something important. Not over the phone, in person. I'll come to you." I almost said no, but some part of me, the part that was still the younger brother looking up to him, I said yes. "Tomorrow," he said. "Morning, Bring whatever documentation you have of your consulting work, your financials, everything." "I don't understand," I said. "Just bring it." When I walked into his office the next morning, he was alone. No partners, no glass tables full of expensive people. Just him, sitting behind his desk looking like he hadn't slept in days. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen from him before. It was something like shame mixed with anger, mixed with desperation all at once. "I need to know if you did it," he said. "Did what?" I responded. "Did you contact the investor? Did you tell him about the Riverside deal, the Meridian project, all the things we glossed over, all the things we didn't fully disclose? Did you reach out to him and poison this entire opportunity?" I didn't answer right away. I was trying to figure out what to say, how much to deny or admit. The truth was sitting there on the table between us, and we both knew it. The truth was that, yes, I had. I'd spent 2 weeks researching him and his investment history. I'd gone through public records and court filings and property transfers, and I'd found something interesting. A pattern. A series of deals my brother had been involved in where investors had lost significant money. Deals where documentation had been questionable. Deals where timelines and projections hadn't panned out. And I'd contacted this investor directly. I'd sent him the information anonymously at first, but when he'd asked for verification, I'd told him who I was. The brother who'd just been humiliated in front of him and his partners. The brother who was apparently not successful enough. He'd wanted to know if the information was credible, if I had any proof, so I'd sent him everything. The public records, the court documents, the complaints from other investors, the patterns, and he'd done his own investigation. He'd pulled his money. He'd killed the deal. And now my brother was sitting across from me, asking me if I'd done it, already knowing the answer. "You destroyed me," he said, his voice breaking. His hands were shaking. "Do you understand what you've done? That deal was going to change everything. It was going to cement my reputation in this industry. These partners, they're connected to everyone. They talk to everyone. And now, because of you, because you decided to play detective and go after me, they're questioning the entire company. They're questioning every deal we've ever done. They want out. All of them." He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. "I can't believe you did this. After everything. After I brought you into that room. After I gave you the opportunity. You're my brother. My own brother." I wanted to say something. I wanted to explain that maybe he shouldn't have humiliated me in front of those men. Maybe he shouldn't have made me question my own worth based on some arbitrary measure of success. Maybe he should have treated me like family instead of like some small-time nobody who wasn't worth his time, but I didn't say any of that. I just sat there and watched him fall apart. "This is going to cost me millions," he continued. "Millions. Not just in the lost deal, but in opportunities. Do you know how this industry works? Do you have any idea? It's about relationships. It's about trust. And you've poisoned my relationships. You've made me look like someone who can't be trusted. My partners are done with me. The investor is done with me. Banks are going to be hesitant to fund my projects. This is going to follow me for years." He turned back to face me, and I saw real fear in his eyes. Fear mixed with rage. "You had no right," he said. "No right to do this to me. I'm your brother. We share the same blood. We came from the same family. And you decided to betray me because I made a joke. Because I said something that hurt your feelings. You decided to burn the whole thing down. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't about feelings. It wasn't about a joke. It was about respect. It was about acknowledging that he had someone in his corner. Someone who believed in him. Someone who would have supported him if he'd just treated me like a human being instead of like an afterthought." But he was still talking. His voice was getting louder. He was pacing. He was gesturing wildly. "Do you know what the investors are saying about me now? Do you know what my colleagues are thinking? They're thinking that Marcus can't control his own family, that he has disloyal people around him, that he's the kind of guy who attracts betrayal. That's what your little crusade has done. You've made me into a cautionary tale. You've made me the guy that everyone warns their partners about." He was breathing heavily now, his face flushed. I could see the veins in his neck. This is going to take years to recover from. Years. I was going to be a player in this industry. Real power, real influence, real wealth, and you took that from me because you couldn't handle being told that you weren't successful enough. You had to prove me wrong. You had to prove that you could bring me down. "That was always your problem," he said, pointing his finger at me. "You've always been jealous of what I had. Always wanted to take it from me. You couldn't build it yourself, so you decided to destroy what I was building." He moved closer to me now. His voice had dropped to something dangerous. That investor. Do you know how many years I spent cultivating that relationship? Do you know how much time I invested in getting him to trust me? And you went behind my back and poisoned the well. You're a snake. You know that? A snake in the grass. And the worst part? The worst part is that I brought you into the room myself. I invited you in. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could do something together. We could actually be brothers. We could actually build something as a team. And this is how you repay that? This is how you say thank you, by destroying me? He stood there staring at me, his breathing ragged. I still didn't respond. What I'd done deliberately. I'd spent those 2 weeks researching him with purpose. I'd contacted that investor knowing exactly what I was doing. I'd sabotaged the deal with full knowledge of the consequences. And I'd done it because in that moment, when he said I wasn't successful enough, something fundamental had shifted in me. I'd stopped being his little brother who wanted his approval. I'd become someone else, someone colder, someone more calculated, someone who understood that he would never see me as an equal, and if he wouldn't see me that way, then I would take something from him to prove that I had power too, that I could affect his life just like he'd affected mine, that I could hurt him. And now, standing in his office watching him unravel, I realized I'd accomplished exactly what I'd set out to do. I'd made him feel small. I'd made him understand what it felt like to have someone you trusted look at you with contempt. He kept talking, but I was barely listening anymore. The words were washing over me like noise. He was telling me about all the plans he'd made based on that deal coming through. He was telling me about loans he'd already taken out, about contracts he'd already signed, about promises he'd already made to other people. He was telling me that my actions had created a domino effect that was now threatening to collapse everything he'd built. And as he talked, I felt something strange. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't the feeling of victory that I thought I'd have. It was something more complicated, something darker. It was the realization that I'd become the kind of person who could look at his own brother's suffering and feel nothing. That I'd let anger and hurt calcify into something that looked a lot like hatred. That I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He suddenly stopped talking and looked at me. "You're not even sorry," he said. "You came in here and you sabotaged my entire career and you're not even sorry. I could have lied. I could have pretended to feel remorse. I could have said I was sorry, that I didn't mean for things to go this far, that I just wanted to scare him a little, but I didn't. I just looked him in the eye and told him the truth. No, I said, I'm not sorry. Maybe I should be. Maybe a better person would be. But I'm not." He flinched like I'd hit him. "You know what this means," he said quietly. "This means we're done. This means I'm going to need to fix this on my own. This means you can't ever come back from this. You can't ever make this right with me. You can't ever be part of my life again." And I knew he was right. I knew that in that moment I'd ended something that had been fragile to begin with. He walked back to his desk slowly and sat down heavily in his chair. "I want you to leave," he said, his voice dead and flat. "Get out of my office. Get out of my life. And don't ever contact me again." I stood up slowly to go, but before I did, I had to say something. I had to make him understand why I'd done it, why I'd gone through with it. "You said I wasn't successful enough," I said. "You looked at me in front of those men and you decided that I was beneath you, that I wasn't worth your time or your respect or even basic human decency. You decided that our connection as brothers meant nothing if it got in the way of your reputation. So I decided something too. I decided that if you were going to treat me like I was nothing, then I was going to make sure everyone else understood exactly what you are. And what am I?" he asked bitterly. "What am I according to you?" "You're someone who builds things on lies," I said. "You're someone who cuts corners and hides it and makes other people pay for it. You're someone who can throw your own family under the bus without blinking. That's what you are." He looked away. "You think you're righteous," he said. "You think you're some kind of hero who's exposing the truth about the corrupt businessman. But you're not. You're just a bitter guy who couldn't make it in this world, so you decided to drag me down with you." "Maybe that's true," I said. "Maybe I am bitter. Maybe I am a failure by your standards. But I'm a failure who knows the difference between right and wrong, and I don't hide behind expensive suits and corporate doublespeak and throwing other people under the bus." He didn't respond. He just sat there staring at his desk. I walked out knowing everything had changed. I'd won something, but in winning it, I'd lost something too. I'd lost the brother I'd spent my entire life trying to connect with. I'd lost the chance that maybe someday things could be different. I'd turned myself into something I didn't recognize, and the worst part was, I wasn't sure I regretted it. The days after I left his office blurred together into something unrecognizable. I went back to work, I answered emails, I took client calls, I went through the motions of being a functional human being while something inside me had gone cold and quiet. I checked my phone constantly, not sure what I was expecting, an apology maybe, a message saying he understood why I'd done what I did, a moment of connection where he finally saw me as something more than just the younger brother who wasn't successful enough. But nothing came, and somewhere in that silence I started paying attention to what was actually happening. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't actively tracking his downfall or following the news or asking mutual acquaintances how he was doing. But information has a way of finding you when you're part of the same world, even if you don't want it to. The first thing I heard was from someone at an industry event I attended. "You know Marcus," the guy said, making casual conversation while we waited for drinks at a networking mixer. "Real estate developer?" "Yeah, I know him," I said carefully. "Heard his deal fell apart. Investor pulled out last minute." The guy shook his head like it was common knowledge. "These things happen in this business, but when they happen fast. One day you're on top of the world, the next day everyone's moving on to the next opportunity. By the end of the week I'd heard 3 more versions of the same story, each one with slightly different details but the same essential truth. The deal was dead. The investor had withdrawn. The partners had backed away. My brother's moment had imploded in spectacular fashion. I told myself I didn't care. I told myself this was what he deserved. I told myself that he'd brought this on himself by being arrogant, by cutting people off, by treating his own family like they were disposable. But late at night, sitting alone in my apartment, I found myself thinking about what that meant. A failed deal in real estate isn't just money. It's trust. It's reputation. It's the foundation that everything else gets built on. If people don't trust you anymore, if the word is out that your deals don't work, if investors see your name and think about loss and broken promises, then you're done, maybe not immediately. Maybe you can limp along for a while, but you're essentially finished. The industry is small, people talk, and once the story starts, it doesn't stop. I wondered if he knew that yet. I wondered if he was sitting in his office realizing what I'd actually done to him. I wondered if he understood that it wasn't just about this one deal. It was about the architecture of his entire professional existence coming apart, because I'd pulled one critical block out of the foundation. 2 weeks after that office meeting, I got a call from someone I knew through work. Someone who ran a commercial real estate consulting firm and had connections throughout the industry. He wanted to grab coffee. He had some questions about my process, he said. Questions that would probably be beneficial for us both to discuss. I agreed because I wasn't sure what else to do, and part of me wanted to understand more of what was happening with my brother. We met at a place downtown. He ordered an espresso and got straight to it. "I wanted to run something by you," he said. "Someone reached out to me asking about Marcus. Your brother, right?" "Yes," I said, already feeling uncomfortable. "He's looking for work. Looking for investors who might be willing to back him on new projects." He told this person that he had a track record of success, that his previous deal had just had some timing issues with market conditions, that it wasn't really about the quality of the deal or the viability of the project. He's trying to rebuild, basically. I didn't respond right away. The coffee shop noise seemed very loud. He continued, "I did some digging because I wanted to make sure I understood the full picture before I recommended him to anyone. And what I found was interesting. There's a history of deals where things didn't quite add up. Investors who lost money, projected returns that didn't materialize. Some of it looks like bad luck or market timing, but some of it looks like maybe the numbers weren't quite right from the beginning. And then there's this most recent thing where the investor pulled out at the last second, which now that I know about the history makes me wonder what he actually knew that made him pull out." I looked away. I didn't want to answer this. I knew where he was going. "He's your brother, so I'm not going to pry," he said. "But if you know anything about why that investor really pulled out, I think Marcus would probably want to know. Because right now he's out there telling people it was just bad timing, and that story doesn't hold up when you really look at the pattern. That investor is savvy. He wouldn't pull that kind of money on a whim. Something happened. Someone told him something. So the question is, are you going to tell him? Or is he going to keep walking around blind, telling a story that everyone in this industry can see through, while his credibility sinks deeper and deeper?" I finished my coffee without answering. I thanked him for the heads up and I left. But his words stuck with me because they pointed at something I hadn't really considered. I'd wanted to hurt my brother. I'd accomplished that. But what I'd also done was set him up for a slower, more complete destruction. By contacting that investor without identifying myself, without making it clear that this was personal and motivated by family conflict, I'd essentially activated the narrative that my brother was someone who engaged in questionable business practices. I'd poisoned the well in a way that would follow him for years. Investors would be cautious, partners would be skeptical, the industry would whisper about him, and the worst part was that he wouldn't even know why. He'd just know that somehow his reputation had been damaged and he couldn't fix it because he didn't know what to fix. I realised in that moment that I'd been so focused on making him pay for what he'd said to me that I'd essentially ended his career. Not just this deal, his career, his future in this industry, everything he'd worked for, and I'd done it in a way that was almost invisible. No direct confrontation, no obvious villain, just a series of anonymous tips that happened to be true, combined with public information that anyone could have found if they'd looked hard enough. I'd been smart about it. I'd been careful, and I'd been completely ruthless. The architecture of destruction is elegant when you really think about it. You don't need to be the one wielding the knife. You just need to make sure everyone knows there's a problem. You just need to point them toward the evidence. You just need to let doubt do the work for you. The investor hadn't killed my brother's deal because I called him. The investor had killed it because I'd given him the tools to see what he should have seen from the beginning. The tools were real. The warnings were legitimate. I'd just been the one to connect the dots, and by staying anonymous, by not making it obvious that this was personal, I'd ensured that the narrative would stick. There was no convenient villain to blame. There was just bad luck, bad patterns, bad outcomes, the kind of stuff that makes people nervous, the kind of stuff that makes people pull their money and run. The question I kept asking myself over the following days was whether I regretted it, and the honest answer was that I didn't know. Part of me felt satisfied in a way I'd never felt before. There was something intoxicating about knowing that I'd outmaneuvered him, that I'd been smarter and more strategic, that I'd won. But part of me felt sick, and part of me was starting to understand that what I'd done had fundamentally changed who I was. I wasn't the person who walked into his office anymore. I wasn't the younger brother looking up with a mixture of admiration and hurt. I was something else now, something harder, something colder, something that could calculate the exact amount of damage needed to destroy another person, even if that person was family. I'd crossed into territory that I didn't know how to navigate anymore. I'd become someone capable of sustained, deliberate harm, not in a moment of anger, not in a moment of passion, but with careful planning and precision. That wasn't me. That had never been me, or at least that's what I'd always told myself. But apparently it was me. Apparently, underneath everything, that's who I'd been all along. It just took being humiliated in front of strangers to bring it out. I kept thinking about what my mother would have said if she could see me now. My parents had always emphasized kindness, loyalty, looking out for each other. They'd always told us that family was the most important thing, that no amount of success was worth sacrificing your integrity or your relationships. They'd have been disappointed in both of us, I think. Disappointed in him for treating me like I was nothing, and disappointed in me for responding the way I had. But they weren't here to be disappointed. They'd been gone for 5 years now, and I was left navigating the wreckage of my relationship with my brother without their guidance. I was left making choices that I wasn't sure I could justify to anyone who actually knew me. I was left with the weight of understanding that I'd become someone capable of deliberately, systematically destroying another person's livelihood, even if that person was my own brother, especially because that person was my own brother. The justification I'd built in my mind started to feel thin and hollow. He'd humiliated me, yes. He'd treated me like I was nothing. That was all true. But was that really enough to warrant what I'd done? Was being told I wasn't successful enough really justification for ending someone's career? The proportionality was completely off. A harsh word. One moment of cruelty, and I'd responded with a coordinated campaign to destroy his professional reputation. I'd responded like someone who'd been planning this for months, not like someone reacting to a single insult. The truth was that I hadn't just reacted. I'd calculated. I'd researched. I'd methodically gathered information and deployed it like a weapon. That wasn't a reaction to being hurt. That was something premeditated. That was something dark. I told myself it was justified. I told myself he'd brought it on himself. I told myself he'd created this situation through his own arrogance and cruelty. But somewhere deep down, I knew the truth. I'd crossed a line. I'd become the villain in my own story. And I couldn't even blame him for how I'd turned out. 3 weeks after the office confrontation, my phone rang. It was my brother. Not a text, not an email asking for a meeting, a direct phone call. His voice when I answered was different from anything I'd heard from him before. It was stripped of everything. No confidence, no edge, no performance. There was just the sound of someone who had been broken and was trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. "I need to see you," he said. "It's important." "I don't think that's a good idea," I responded. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said." He was quiet for a moment. "Please," he said. "I'm asking you as your brother. I'm asking you to give me 1 hour, one conversation. After that, if you want me out of your life forever, I'll go. But I need you to hear me out first." Something in his voice made me say yes. I told him to come to my house the next evening. I told myself it was because I wanted to see him suffer. I told myself I wanted to watch him squirm and beg and understand what it felt like to be powerless. I told myself I wanted to see the golden child finally brought down to earth. I told myself a lot of things that felt justified and righteous. That's what I told myself. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that I missed him, even after everything, even knowing what he'd done and what I'd done in response. Some part of me still wanted my brother back. Some part of me was hoping that he would walk through my door and say something that would make sense of all of this. Some part of me was hoping that maybe there was a way to fix it. But I knew better. I knew that some things, once broken, couldn't be put back together. Some betrayals couldn't be forgiven. Some damage was permanent. I'd made sure of that. The day he was supposed to come, I spent the entire morning cleaning my house. I vacuumed. I straightened up the kitchen. I threw away old magazines and mail. I did laundry. I organised my books. I was trying to look like my life was together, like I hadn't spent the past 3 weeks in a fog of guilt and regret and anger all mixed together. I was trying to look like I'd made the right choices, like I was winning. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd run out of things to clean. I'd done everything I could to make my house look like the home of someone who had his life figured out, someone who wasn't tormented by the weight of what he'd done. I sat on my couch and waited, and as the minutes ticked by, I started to question why I'd agreed to this. Why had I said yes to his request for 1 hour? What did I hope would happen? Was I actually thinking that he could explain it away? Was I actually hoping that there was some misunderstanding that could be cleared up? Or was I just cruel enough to want to watch him beg? I wasn't even sure anymore. I'd become so tangled up in my own emotions that I couldn't separate what was real from what I was telling myself. The clock on my wall seemed to move slower and slower. 6 o'clock got closer. I could feel my heart rate increasing as the time approached. I was nervous. Actually nervous. Like I was about to do something momentous. Which I was, I suppose. This was the moment where I'd either find a way to be compassionate with my brother, or I'd confirm that I was exactly the kind of person he'd suggested I was. Exactly the kind of person who wasn't successful enough. Exactly the kind of person who didn't matter. By 6 o'clock I was already angry all over again. Angry at him for making me feel this way. Angry at myself for still caring. Angry at the situation itself for being so complicated and so painful. At 6 on the dot, there was a knock on my door. I opened it, and there he was. My brother. Except he wasn't my brother anymore. At least not the version I remembered. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks. His suit hung loose on him. His face was haggard, unshaven. There were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep was going to fix. His hands were shaking. His hair looked like it hadn't been combed in days. He looked destroyed. He looked like someone who had lost everything. He looked like exactly what I'd wanted him to look like, and I should have felt good about that. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt like I'd won. But instead, looking at him standing on my porch in that state, all I felt was tired. I felt like I'd been carrying something heavy for weeks, and I was finally starting to feel the weight of it. I stepped back and let him inside without saying anything. He walked past me slowly, like he wasn't sure his legs would support him. Like every step was an effort. He sat down on my couch, and I sat across from him in the armchair, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. He was trying to compose himself. I could see him breathing, trying to get his emotions under control. This was the moment. This was where he was going to apologize. This was where he was going to beg forgiveness and ask for help and admit that he'd been wrong about everything. This was where I was going to tell him no. This was where I was going to tell him that I'd destroyed him deliberately, that I'd known exactly what I was doing, that I had no regrets. I was already preparing my words. I was already planning the moment where I'd look him in the eye and tell him that he wasn't successful enough to be part of my life anymore. But before I could say anything, he started talking. "I know what you did," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know that you contacted the investor. I know that you told him about my history. I know that you poisoned the well on purpose." I didn't deny it. There was no point. He already knew. His partners had probably told him, or he'd figured it out himself through process of elimination. Either way, the secret was out and there was nothing I could do about that anymore. "How did you figure it out?" I asked. "Does it matter?" he responded. "The result is the same. You destroyed me. You took the one thing I had going for me and you systematically dismantled it. And for what? Because I said something mean to you? Because I hurt your feelings in front of some people? You decided that was worth ending my career?" He stood up and started pacing, and suddenly he didn't look so fragile anymore. He looked angry. He looked desperate. He looked like someone whose world had fallen apart and was now realizing that I'd been the one to push it over the edge. "Everything I built," he said, "everything I worked for, all of it gone because you wanted revenge. I had partners who trusted me. I had a reputation in this industry. I had opportunities lined up. And now I'm toxic. No one will return my calls. No one will even meet with me because word is out that there's something wrong with my deals, something wrong with me. Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea what it's like to wake up one morning and realize that you're finished? That everything you spent your entire life building has been dismantled overnight by your own brother? I should have told him to leave. I should have thrown him out of my house right then and there. I should have told him that he deserved it, that he should have thought about consequences before he humiliated me. But I didn't. I just sat there and listened. I listened to his accusations. I listened to his pain. And somewhere in the middle of listening to him, I started to understand that maybe I wasn't the hero of this story after all. Maybe I was something worse. "The banks are calling me," he continued. "They want their money back. The development deals I had lined up are all falling through because the investors have lost confidence. My partners have formally dissolved our partnership. Do you know how many people are depending on me? How many people I've promised work and opportunity to? I've let them all down because I'm standing in front of you in a state of complete collapse." He sat back down and put his head in his hands. "I've been thinking about ending this," he said. And I didn't know what he meant at first. Ending what? Ending everything. It's become unbearable. The shame. The failure. The knowledge that I'm finished in this industry at the age of 45. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to explain why my career imploded. I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if it could have been different. If I'd just been nicer to you. If I'd just treated you with more respect. If I'd just let you in that day instead of making you a joke. But I didn't do that. And now I'm here. I'm here begging for your forgiveness, or your help, or your understanding, or something. Anything. Because I don't know what to do anymore." He looked up at me and I could see that he was crying. Actual tears running down his face, and I felt something crack inside me. That place where I'd stored all my anger and all my justification, and all my certainty that I'd done the right thing. It cracked and something else started leaking out. Something darker. Something that looked an awful lot like regret. I destroyed him. I'd actually done it. I'd said I wanted to make him understand what I felt. I'd said I wanted him to be humiliated, and I'd succeeded. I'd completely and totally succeeded. And now I had to live with the fact that I'd turned my own brother into this shell of a person sitting on my couch crying. He was right about one thing. If I'd just treated him with more respect, if I'd just let him in, if I'd just been part of his life instead of someone looking in from the outside. But I couldn't change that now. The moment had passed. The damage had been done, and there was no undoing it. He looked at me with eyes that were empty and broken and desperate all at once. "I'm asking you to help me," he said. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have anyone else to ask. Our parents are gone. We don't have other family. It's just us. It's always been just us. And I know I treated you badly. I know I was cruel. I know I made you feel small and insignificant. But you're my brother. That has to mean something. That has to count for something. Please. I just need help. I just need you to tell me that there's a way to come back from this, that I'm not finished, that there's still something worth saving." He leaned forward with his hands clasped together in what looked like actual prayer, begging. My successful, confident, unbreakable brother was sitting on my couch begging me for help, and I realized that this was the moment I'd been waiting for. This was the moment where I could crush him completely, where I could tell him no, where I could tell him that he wasn't successful enough to be part of my life anymore, where I could throw his own words back at him and watch him break. I had all the power now. Everything had shifted. I was the one sitting in judgment. I was the one deciding his fate. I was the one who could save him or destroy him completely. And as I sat there looking at my brother in his moment of complete vulnerability, I realized something that terrified me. I realized that I was actually considering it. I was actually thinking about walking away and leaving him to fall apart completely. And worse than that, I realized I wanted to. That's when I made my choice. That's when I finally understood what I was actually capable of. I looked at him sitting there with his hands clasped together like a penitent in a confession booth, and I said nothing. I just stood up and walked to the kitchen. I heard him follow me, his footsteps hesitant, unsure. My heart was pounding as I moved. This was it. This was the moment where I could either show him mercy or show him exactly who he'd created by pushing me into a corner. From the cabinet above the refrigerator, I pulled down an old manila folder. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected them to shake, but they didn't. I was completely calm. It was like I'd stepped outside of myself and become someone else entirely. Someone who could do this without flinching. Inside were printed emails, documented conversations, screenshots of his past deals. All the evidence I'd compiled before I'd contacted the investor. All the ammunition I'd carefully gathered over those 3 weeks when I'd told him nothing. I'd printed everything out and organized it chronologically. I wanted him to see the narrative arc of his failure, to understand how each piece of evidence had led me to the next. I laid it out on the kitchen counter in front of him methodically, spreading the papers out like a prosecutor presenting a case. "This is what I used," I said. "This is what I found that made the investor so nervous. This is why he pulled his money. Not because he heard something vague from some anonymous caller. Because he saw the pattern. Because he looked at the evidence and realized he was dealing with someone who either didn't know what he was doing or was deliberately misleading people. Bank records showing money flowing in and out of his accounts in ways that didn't match the narrative he was selling. Previous investors who'd lost money, their names all there in black and white. Patterns of behavior that looked, when you put them all together, like someone who didn't know what he was doing or someone who was doing it deliberately. Pick one." He stared at the papers without touching them. His face was going grey. I could see him trying to process what he was looking at. He reached out once, like he might touch the documents, then pulled his hand back like they were contaminated. "There was more to it than just documents, though," I continued. "I made a call to that investor. I didn't identify myself. I just said that I had some concerns about the viability of his project, and I suggested he do his own research. I gave him your name and the names of 3 previous investors. I told him to ask them how their money had worked out. And he did ask them, and they told him the truth, that they'd lost everything, that your numbers didn't add up, that you were either incompetent or dishonest, and probably both. And suddenly, that $220,000 investment didn't seem so safe anymore. The investor did more digging after that. He called people in the industry, he asked questions, he started seeing the pattern himself, and it made him nervous, so he pulled the money. And when he pulled the money, your whole operation started to look suspicious to everyone else. That's how these things work. One person doubts and suddenly everyone's asking questions. One person pulls out and suddenly no one wants to invest." "You're not successful enough," I added, using his exact words back at him. "That's what you said to me." "Well, now you're not successful enough for anyone to risk money with. How does that feel?" His face had gone completely white. "You did this," he said. His voice was barely audible. "You did this on purpose." "Yes," I said. "On purpose. Deliberately. Methodically. I spent 3 weeks researching your past. 3 weeks where I went to work every day and smiled at people and pretended everything was normal, while at night I sat in my apartment going through every deal you'd ever made, every partnership you'd formed, every investor you'd worked with. I contacted that investor from a burner phone so it couldn't be traced back to me. I was careful. I was smart. I made sure everything I told him was true, which is the beauty of it, really. You can't sue me for slander when every single thing I said was factually accurate. You can't claim defamation when I was just telling the truth. And the truth is that your deals don't work. The truth is that you're running a house of cards. The truth is that everyone with money is finally figuring it out." He sat down hard on one of the kitchen stools like his legs had given out. "How could you do this to your own brother?" he whispered. "How could I do it?" I laughed, and it sounded bitter even to my own ears. "You humiliated me. You called me a failure in front of your partners. You told me I wasn't successful enough to be part of something. You said it like it was a fact, like it was obvious, like everyone in the room was thinking the same thing, but only you were brave enough or cruel enough to say it out loud. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Do you understand what it does to a person to hear that from their own brother? That's the person you're supposed to trust most. That's the person who's supposed to have your back no matter what. That's the person you're supposed to go to when the rest of the world doesn't believe in you, and you threw me away like I was nothing. So yeah, I did this. I did exactly this. I planned it, I researched it, I executed it, and I'm not sorry. I meant it when I said it. I wasn't sorry. But I was lying to myself about not being sorry. I was lying to myself about how I felt watching him fall apart in front of me. Because even as he sat there broken and destroyed, even as I saw the evidence of what I'd done reflected in his face, there was this deep part of me that was starting to understand the cost of what I'd accomplished. I'd wanted him to suffer. I'd wanted him to understand. I'd wanted him to feel small and insignificant the way he'd made me feel small and insignificant. And I'd succeeded. I'd succeeded completely and totally. And now I had to live with that success. That was the thing nobody tells you about revenge. Nobody tells you that success in destroying someone else is going to feel like failure. Nobody tells you that watching someone break under the weight of what you've done is going to break something in you too. I'd gotten what I wanted, and it was turning out to be the worst thing that could have happened to me. He left my house about an hour after that. He didn't beg anymore. He didn't try to explain or justify or bargain. He just got up and walked toward the door like he was moving through water, like every step required conscious effort. At the door, he turned back and looked at me one more time. "I used to think you were the strongest person I knew," he said. "I thought you had this quiet strength that just carried you through everything. I thought that's why you'd never complained, never demanded anything from me, never asked for help. I thought you were just naturally resilient. But that's not what this is it? This isn't strength. This is something else. This is something broken masquerading as justice. This is revenge dressed up as righteousness." And I realized as I stood there watching him say these things that he was right. I'd been telling myself a story about justice. I'd been telling myself that I was righting a wrong, that I was teaching him a lesson, that he deserved what was happening to him. But the truth was uglier than that. The truth was that I'd become the villain in my own narrative. I'd had the power to hurt him, and I'd chosen to use it. I'd had the option to be merciful, and I'd chosen cruelty instead. He left, and I didn't stop him. I let him walk out of my house, and I let the door close behind him, and I stood there in my clean apartment that I'd spent the morning organising, trying to make it look like I had things together, and I felt the weight of what I'd done settle on my shoulders like something physical, like something that was going to be very hard to put down. The weeks after that were strange. I went to work, I did my job. People around me seemed to exist in a normal world where normal things happened. My co-workers talked about their weekend plans and their lunch orders, and the Netflix shows they were watching. The world continued to spin on its axis like nothing had changed. But something had changed for me. Something fundamental had shifted and I couldn't quite put it back the way it was. I kept thinking about my brother. I kept wondering where he was and what he was doing and whether he was okay. Whether he was actually capable of doing the thing he'd talked about, the thing he'd said about not being able to bear it anymore. I knew people who'd lost family members to suicide. I'd heard the stories. I knew the aftermath. I knew the guilt and the what-ifs and the terrible knowledge that you could have done something differently. And I started to understand that there was a very real possibility that I'd crossed a line that I couldn't uncross, that I'd hurt someone so badly that the damage might be permanent in ways I hadn't fully considered. A month after he left my house, I got a call from a hospital. It was brief and clinical. "Your brother was admitted to the psychiatric ward 3 days ago. He's stable now. He's asked to see you." I don't remember driving to the hospital. I don't remember parking or walking through the corridors or finding his room. But suddenly I was standing in a hospital room looking at my brother sitting up in a bed with a hospital bracelet on his wrist and a hollowness in his eyes that I recognized because I'd put it there. The room smelled like antiseptic and industrial cleaning supplies. There was a cardiac monitor beeping softly in the background. The window looked out onto a grey afternoon. He didn't say anything when I came in. He just looked at me, and I looked at him. And for the first time since all of this started, I felt the weight of what I'd actually done. Not the theoretical weight, not the justified weight of making someone understand what they'd done to me, the actual weight of knowing that I'd pushed another human being to a place where they'd decided life wasn't worth living. He'd tried to kill himself. He'd sat alone in his apartment with the windows closed and the lights off, and he'd decided that the best option was to not exist anymore, that my destruction of his career and his reputation and his sense of self was so complete that death had seemed like a better alternative. And the only reason he hadn't succeeded was because a neighbour had heard something and called an ambulance, a neighbour who didn't even really know him. A stranger had saved his life because I'd destroyed it so completely. I sat down in the chair next to his bed without asking permission. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "I don't know how to apologise for what I did, or how to make you understand how sorry I actually am. I don't know how to explain the fact that I destroyed you, not because I believed what I said, but because I was in a bad place, and I needed to feel like I was bigger than someone. I don't know how to take it back or how to fix it. So I'm just going to sit here and tell you that I'm sorry, that I was wrong, that you didn't deserve what I did to you, that I'm seeing a therapist and I'm on medication and I'm trying to understand why I felt the need to cut you down the way I did. I can't undo any of it, but I can tell you that if you want to come to my therapy sessions, if you want to be part of my getting better, I'd like that. Not because it fixes things, not because everything's okay now, but because you're my brother and I don't want to lose you permanently." I realised sitting there in that hospital room that I had a choice in front of me. I could maintain my anger. I could continue to believe that he'd gotten what he deserved. I could walk out and cut him out of my life completely. Or I could try to find a way to repair something that I'd spent the last 3 months systematically destroying. And I realised that the hardest part about having power over someone is that eventually you have to live with the person you become when you use it. I went to his therapy sessions with him, not everyone, but most of them. I sat in waiting rooms and watched him disappear behind doors with a therapist I'd never met, and I had time to think about what it meant that I was willing to do this. I listened to him talk about his insecurities and his need to dominate and his fear of being irrelevant in a world where success was measured in very specific ways. I listened to him explain that he'd cut me down because he was terrified that I'd eventually surpass him, that deep down, despite all the evidence to the contrary, he was afraid of me. And as I sat there listening, I started to understand that his cruelty hadn't come from a place of actual belief. It hadn't come from genuine contempt. It had come from fear, from a man who was so insecure that he needed to feel bigger than everyone around him, even his own brother. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it contextualized it in a way that made it easier to separate the action from the person. He was a flawed human being who'd said something cruel. I was a flawed human being who'd responded with systematic destruction. We were both wrong. We were both capable of terrible things. The difference was that he'd been forced to see his own darkness through a mental health crisis and hospitalization, whereas I'd been allowed to hide mine behind the justification that I was just being smart and strategic and proportional. The truth was that I'd enjoyed it. That was the part that was hardest to admit even to myself. I'd enjoyed planning his downfall. I'd enjoyed the research phase, the detective work, the careful assembly of evidence. I'd enjoyed seeing him suffer when I revealed what I'd done. I'd enjoyed thinking about him struggling to understand how his career had imploded. There had been a satisfaction in knowing that I'd outmaneuvered him, that I'd been the smarter one, that I'd had the last word, and that enjoyment was the thing that actually terrified me, because it meant that somewhere inside me was someone capable of sustained, deliberate cruelty, someone who could justify anything if the motivation was strong enough, someone who could hurt another person and feel good about it as long as I had a good enough reason, someone who was only separated from being a genuinely terrible person by circumstance and choice. And now I had to decide what kind of person I actually wanted to be, because I could feel the weight of that choice becoming clearer every day. After 3 weeks in the hospital, my brother was discharged with a prescription for antidepressants, a weekly therapy appointment scheduled, and a job at a local restaurant. Not glamorous, not successful by the standards we'd been measuring ourselves against, but real work that paid the bills and didn't require him to pretend to be someone he wasn't. There was something almost sacred about that simplicity. A job that was what it was. No pretense, no performance, just work and money and the basic dignity of being employed. He moved into an apartment across town, and we started the slow process of rebuilding a relationship that had been damaged, maybe irreparably, by both of us. It was awkward at first. There was so much unsaid between us. So much damage that couldn't be undone by good intentions or therapy or even time. I invited him over for dinner one evening about 2 months after his discharge. I made nothing fancy. Just pasta and salad and some basic bread from the grocery store. I wanted it to feel normal. I wanted it to feel like something two brothers might do without the weight of everything pressing down on us. He arrived carrying a bottle of wine and looking like someone who was learning to exist again. There was a fragility to him that hadn't been there before, a gentleness that suggested he'd been broken down to his essentials and was learning to build himself back up differently. We ate and we talked about neutral things, his new job, a show we both liked, a movie that was coming out. We kept the conversation light, almost aggressively so, like we were both terrified of what might happen if we let the silence settle too long. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't rehash the cruelty or the revenge or the hospital visit. We just existed in the same space like two people who were both learning how to be brothers again. After dinner, sitting on my couch with the wine mostly finished, he finally brought it up. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me, "about not being successful enough. And I realized that I said those things because I needed you to be less than me. Because if you were less than me, then I could stop comparing myself to you. I could stop feeling like I was failing. I could maintain this image of myself as the golden child, the successful one, the one who had it all figured out. But the thing is, I never had it figured out. I was one missed payment away from everything falling apart. I was one bad decision away from disaster, and that terrified me. So I cut you down. And you destroyed me. And maybe that's the way it had to go. Maybe we both needed to learn what it felt like to be completely vulnerable and powerless. Maybe we both needed to understand that success and failure aren't actually the most important things. That family and connection and the ability to admit when you're wrong, that's actually what matters." I didn't respond immediately. I thought about the previous months. I thought about the satisfaction I'd felt watching him fall. I thought about the horror I'd felt in the hospital room. I thought about the choice I'd made to show up anyway, and I understood that we were both damaged in ways that we'd have to carry with us for a long time, maybe forever. But we were choosing to carry it together. We were choosing to face it instead of running from it. That had to mean something. He left that night, and I sat alone on my couch thinking about everything that had led us to this point. I'd wanted revenge. I'd wanted him to understand the pain he'd caused me. I'd wanted him to suffer the way I'd suffered. And I'd gotten exactly what I wanted. But what I'd learned in the process was that revenge doesn't feel the way you think it's going to feel. It doesn't satisfy. It doesn't provide closure. It just creates more damage and more pain and more guilt that you have to find a way to live with. I told myself that I didn't care about hurting him. I told myself that he deserved it. But the truth was that I did care. I cared a lot. I cared so much that it had nearly cost him his life, and was going to change the way I saw myself for the rest of my life. The victory I'd imagined had turned into ashes in my mouth. I'd done what I'd set out to do. I'd made him understand what it felt like to be irrelevant and insignificant and powerless. I'd made him know fear. I'd made him question whether his life was worth living. I'd made him lie in a hospital bed with a bracelet on his wrist signifying that he was a danger to himself because of something I'd done. And now I had to live with the fact that I was capable of that. That I was the kind of person who could do that if I felt sufficiently justified. That I was the kind of person who could calculate exactly how much damage was needed and deliver it with surgical precision. That was the real punishment. That was the thing that would stay with me longer than any satisfaction I'd felt in the moment of execution. I'd learned something about myself that I couldn't unknow. I'd learned that I was capable of darkness. I'd learned that I had a capacity for cruelty that was both impressive and terrifying. And I had to find a way to live with that knowledge without letting it define who I was going to be going forward. That was going to be the hard part. Not the revenge, not the plotting or the research or the execution. That was easy. That had been easy because I'd been angry and justified and convinced that I was right. The hard part was going to be choosing to be better than what I'd proven to myself I was capable of. The hard part was going to be sitting with my brother in therapy sessions and listening to him talk about his pain, while also acknowledging that I'd created that pain deliberately. The hard part was going to be forgiving myself for what I'd done, and maybe, if I could figure out how to do that, I could help him forgive me too. That was going to be the real test. Not whether I could destroy someone. I'd already proven I could do that. The test was whether I could choose not to, whether I could choose compassion over cruelty, whether I could choose to be the person my brother was wrong about instead of the person he'd feared I might become.